The Bible makes hundreds, if not thousands, of statements about money. I want to share a simple mnemonic: land, laws, Lord, and love. I think everything the Bible says about money can fit under one of these four categories. The Old Testament primarily focuses on the first two. It's all about the land, the promised land, and also about the laws. There will be a few books that I'll pull out as we walk through the Bible. One of those is the book of Genesis. Now, this book is primarily a book of stories, but the main thread that runs through all of Genesis' stories is the promised land. It's been promised to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all their descendants. And the book of Genesis describes how they move throughout the promised land. They're living there as sojourners. They don't actually own land there. They're just traveling around with their flocks and herds. But God has promised the land to them, and that promise just hasn't been fulfilled yet. You've got to realize that land is still a huge deal today when we talk about money. Most of the world's wealth is actually tied up in some form of real estate. It could be undeveloped land, houses, commercial buildings. And if you add up the value of all those assets, it's a lot more than the world's stock markets and other businesses. A lot of the money that circulates in the economy is also tied to the land. Imagine if you have a mortgage for your house. The collateral for that mortgage loan is your house and the land it's built on. At the end of Genesis, Jacob and his descendants go down to Egypt. In Egypt, the Israelites initially prosper, but later on they're oppressed and turned into slaves by Pharaoh and the other Egyptians. The first part of the book of Exodus tells the story of how God sends Moses to free the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. At this point, the structure of the Bible changes. So part of the way through Exodus, we shift more towards laws. So it outlines different laws that the Israelites need to follow, some of them currently and some of them that won't actually apply until they reach the promised land and settle down in it. There are still stories in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but the main emphasis is on these laws. Quite a few of the laws deal with sacrifices, different animals that the Israelites had that they needed to bring to the tabernacle or later the temple, how those animals were to be killed and offered on the altar. And some of those parts of the animal could actually be eaten by the Israelites. Another category is laws dealing with relationships between people. So a lot of these are financial laws of one kind or another. For example, the gleaning law said that anyone who has a field and they sow their crop in that field, they need to leave some of it around the edges for the poor and the sojourner, people who aren't Israelites. There were also laws regarding restitution. In general, if someone caused damage to another person's property, he would have to make good on it. There were also quite a few laws regarding the land itself. So land could be sold, but only temporarily. Every 50 years, there would be a sort of reset period called a jubilee, in which anyone who had sold land would get it back. So when they sold land, it was only done with the time in mind until the next Jubilee. So let's say it's 20 years until the next Jubilee, and I sell my land to you to plant crops in it. It's not really selling, I'm more like leasing the land to you for the next 20 years. This brings us to another category of related laws, which are those dealing with inheritance. So the land was to be passed down from father to son, generation after generation. And that land was never to depart from, the original family line of the person who had it. So there are a lot of laws that are kind of guiding, edge cases in this inheritance. For example, there was a group of women who were all sisters. They had the same father. Their father did not have any sons. How do we deal with this guy's inheritance? And it was decided, well, these women need to all marry within the same tribe. So there were 12 tribes of Israel. They need to marry within the same tribe so that their father's lands, which they are going to inherit, will stay within the same tribe and not be given to another tribe. Those inheritance laws, along with the Jubilee laws, ensured that the the financial system that the Jews had, the Israelites had, would not see the same kind of huge swings in wealth disparity that we see today. Most of the wealth and land and property and businesses, ending up being owned by a very few number of people. But if you imagine the laws I just described in Israel, if they had followed those laws, and that's a big if because they never really did follow those laws, but if they had, it could have prevented a lot of this grouping and clustering of wealth that tends to happen, because there was that mechanism. Every 50 years, okay, now the land needs to go back to the people who had it before, or the family who had it before. Now as we leave Deuteronomy and go into the historical books, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and so on, that big question of if they followed the laws is the one that all these historical books turn on. You see, the historical books record this ongoing cycle in which the Israelites will turn to God, seek Him, obey Him, and He will bless and prosper them. But then, after a while, they'll turn away. They'll decide to stop following the law. They'll totally forget about it. They'll worship other gods. They won't care about doing these things like, providing for gleaning, providing for the poor and the foreigners in their midst. They'll totally stop doing all that stuff, and each person will pursue his own gain and his own good to the exclusion of everyone else. At that point, God will bring about some kind of punishment on them. It's often done through one of their neighbors, so the Philistines or the neighbors later on like the Babylonians, sometimes even making them slaves again so that they're no longer a sovereign nation of their own. And then the cycle repeats. Eventually they repent, or they get a new leader who resolves to follow God, and the nation will turn again, start obeying the law, and God will return to bless them again. Now in our Bibles, after the historical books comes the wisdom literature. But I want to skip over that momentarily to pursue this story into the prophets. So the story of Israel's rise and fall spiritually and materially really reaches its climax and conclusion before the New Testament in the prophets. So the prophets come out with these messages saying, you're not doing what God told you, you've totally disregarded the law, you've disregarded the people around you. At times you've maybe even followed the letter of the law, but haven't really followed the spirit of it. And the prophets are giving them kind of a final warning, a bunch of final warnings, that if you don't change, if you don't turn back to God fully, He's going to actually do the sort of ultimate punishment, going all the way back to the land in Genesis, the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what is that ultimate punishment? You're actually going to be taken out of the land. You're going to be exiled, end up in Babylon, Assyria. You're going to lose your identity as a people. So all those notions of inheritance, passing the land down from father to son, also staying separate from the nations around them so that they would be God's holy chosen people. The prophets are basically saying to the Israelites, your identity as a people, as God's chosen people, is going to be destroyed. Now, we've skipped over the wisdom literature, which I want to come back to now. The wisdom books include Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. These books are not part of the main storyline. In fact, some of them even call into question many of the main themes of the other books in the Old Testament. One theme is the idea that as a person is godly, is holy, is doing the right thing, that God tends to bless them materially. So spiritual blessing leads to material blessing. The book of Job calls this into question in several important ways. Job is a wealthy and godly man who's doing everything right, but he gets caught in this battle between God and Satan, where Satan is trying to tempt Job to curse God, to turn away from Him by taking away first all his physical possessions and his family, and then taking away his health. This loss of his health and his wealth was not brought on by Job at all, which is the story that we see in the rest of the Old Testament. And while Job does receive some rebuke from God towards the end of the book, it's also clear that Job is is living at a higher level than the people around him. His three friends who are trying to give him advice throughout this book are actually in much bigger trouble from God than Job is. And God reprimands them more harshly and says, I'm going to have Job pray for you and then I'll forgive you. So when we frame Job this way, it's basically the story of a righteous man who is cursed materially even in the midst of his righteousness. On the flip side, we can look at the book of Ecclesiastes, which is written by a man who was blessed materially in every way possible while still turning away from God. And God never cursed him, never took away his wealth or possessions. But in Ecclesiastes, he's depressed. He's often confused about the meaning of life. He doesn't know what the purpose is. He basically has everything that you could ever desire in this world in terms of wealth, money, physical possessions, beautiful things, and he's not happy. He's despairing. He's questioning the meaning of life. So again, in Ecclesiastes, we see this tension where spiritual prosperity and material prosperity don't necessarily fit hand in hand, even though that's the thrust of much of the rest of the Old Testament. When people talk about the Bible and money, Proverbs is usually one of the favorite books for that kind of topic. This is where we find a lot of, short, pithy sayings of wisdom that actually can be valuable if someone's wanting to make good financial decisions in this world. There's a lot of variety here in the statements that are made, but they do fit into a few different categories. There's a lot of different proverbs that are about working hard and kind of giving the consequences of working hard, the consequences of being slothful or lazy, and kind of laying that out, saying, well, obviously you want to work hard. Another favorite verse from this book is that the borrower is slave to the lender. So this is one that Dave Ramsey's really built the most effective parts of his financial advice on, teaching people how to get out of debt, pay off their credit cards, and to avoid debt in the future. As we move on to the New Testament, those themes of land and laws give way to the themes of Lord and love. The Gospels show that a lot of Jesus' followers, even those closest to him, like the 12 disciples, thought that his purpose as Messiah was to kick out the Romans and give Israel back its sovereignty. In other words, to give it back its land. Because at that point, Israel had spent hundreds of years, well, with some breaks here and there, but they had spent hundreds of years being under the dominion of other nations. And so the Jews were starting to ask the question, when is God going to give us back our promised land? But Jesus points his disciples in a different direction. Jesus draws their focus to him, that he's the Lord and he's the one they need to follow. The inheritance that's really important is not an inheritance of land anymore. It's a heavenly inheritance. It's an inheritance in God's kingdom. And the point is not to follow the law to the letter, but the point is to embody the law through love for their neighbors. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus uses this device over and over again where he says, "You have heard that it was written, but instead I tell you." So the "you have heard it was written" part is talking about the law. Okay, you've heard this was the law, but I tell you, and then he raises the bar for them to a higher level. A lot of those kind of statements that Jesus makes are directly related to money. He says if someone sues you to take your cloak, give him your tunic as well. Give to the one who asks to borrow from you, and don't worry about what you'll eat or drink or what you'll wear, because your Father in heaven will provide for your needs. A lot of the parables have money as the subject. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus talks a lot about money. It's probably one of his favorite subjects if you just go through and count verse by verse. Where is he talking about money versus other subjects? I would bet it's one of the top 2 or 3 at least. The best summary of all the things Jesus says about money might be the statement that you cannot serve both God and money. We cannot have 2 masters. So if a person is serving money and pursuing it as their first priority, they cannot at the same time serve God. Moving to the book of Acts, we see a bunch of stories about the early church and how they lived. They had a pretty radical lifestyle. It says that they shared everything in common. That first group of a few thousand that was in Jerusalem, they shared everything in common. Those who had lands or houses often would sell them and then take that money and give it to the disciples, the 12 disciples, so that they could distribute the money to anyone in the community who had needs. That phase didn't last forever. At some point, the church was scattered from Jerusalem, so it spread to a bunch of other cities in the Roman Empire. And within each of those cities, it tended to prosper, and more people were coming into the faith. Not only Jews, but Gentiles or non-Jewish people as well. At this point, we don't see the same radical sharing of literally everything in common as at the very beginning of the book of Acts. But we do see that to some extent. So, for example, Paul, as he's going on his missionary journeys through these different cities, at times he's collecting money from a church in one city to give to a church in another city. So even though those Christians were spread out, they were still identifying with one another enough to be able to be willing to give up some of their material wealth to help Christians in other parts of the world. Most of the rest of the New Testament is made up of the epistles. So these are letters from Paul, Peter, James, John, maybe a few other people to different churches or individuals. And those letters mostly overlap a lot chronologically with the book of Acts. In these letters, we do see some instructions or exhortations to Christians to give to Christians who are in other cities. Like Paul's saying he's going to come and collect an offering, which he's going to take to Jerusalem. But for the most part, when it comes to money, we see a lot of statements about who are the people that you come in contact with day to day. If you see someone in need and you're able to meet that need, then do it, especially if they're part of your Christian community. This is one of the ways that the Christians will show their love and care and concern for others. Like Jesus said, to love your neighbor as you love yourself. So if you're hungry or you're cold and you need more clothing, you'll go out and buy that. Same thing if your family needs it. If your children are hungry or they need clothing, of course you'll go and buy that. And a lot of the epistles are saying, okay, don't stop there. Go beyond that. Look at the other people in your circle and see their needs. And if you're able, go meet their needs as well. This is one of the ways that we as Christians demonstrate and show our love and show our faith, so that it's not just something that we talk about, or it's not just a belief in our mind, but it's something we actually practice. It's something that actually makes a difference in the way that we live day after day after day. This has been a really big picture overview of what the Bible says about money, possessions, and wealth. If you're like me, you would really like next to get into more of the details. So you can check out this playlist here. It gets into a bunch of the Old Testament financial laws, such as the gleaning law, kinsman redeemer law, the law about Thanksgiving offerings. So check that out.